1815. The Tuileries Palace, Paris. The air in the royal cabinet is thick with the ghost of recently vanquished power, a cloying mixture of beeswax, old paper, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. Outside, the city holds its breath, the cobblestones still seeming to echo with the tramp of retreating imperial guards and the rumble of Prussian cannons. Inside stands a man who is the living embodiment of the last 25 years of revolutionary chaos. Joseph Fouché, Duke of Otranto, his face a pale, unreadable mask, stands before the Comte d'Artois, the brother of the king he helped send to the guillotine. Fouché's movements are precise, economical, his black silk suit absorbing the candlelight, making him appear more shadow than man. He, the regicide, the terrorist, the secret policeman of the Corsican usurper, is here to hand France back to the Bourbons. He holds a portfolio of documents, lists, reports, the secret anatomy of the nation, and in his toneless voice, he dictates the terms of the monarchy's restoration. This is the narrative of him, the ultimate survivor. This is the moment of his most audacious, most cynical, and most complete triumph. It is the culmination of a life spent dancing on the edge of the abyss, a life that poses the central, maddening question of his age. In a world of titans, of revolutionary fanatics like Robespierre and military geniuses like Napoleon, of fervent royalists and die-hard republicans, how did this colorless, bloodless phantom, a man with no personal charisma, no fixed principles, no loyal army, not only survive, but thrive? How did Joseph Fouché, the master of betrayal, outlive every single ruler he ever served, always retaining his grip on the levers of power, while thrones crumbled and giants were dashed to pieces? To understand this man, we must return to the world that spawned him, a world about to be consumed by fire. This is the saga of Joseph Fouché, the pale phantom of the revolution, a man whose very existence is a paradox that mocks the grand narratives of his time. To understand him is to understand the secret mechanics of power, stripped of all its ideological vestments. How did a man with no army, no dynasty, and no discernible beliefs become the immovable center of gravity in French politics for a quarter of a century, while titans fell around him like leaves in autumn? His story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, in the shadows of a dying world. We see him in 1815, the architect of a new government, calmly handing the keys of the kingdom to a monarch whose brother he had condemned to death. This single act of breathtaking cynicism is the Rosetta Stone of his entire career. He was the perpetual minister, the man who swore oaths to the Republic, the Directory, the Consulate, the Empire, and the restored monarchy, and broke them all with the same chilling impassivity. While Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, preached a gospel of virtue and terror and ended on the guillotine, while Georges Danton, the fiery orator, roared for audacity and was silenced by that same blade, while Napoleon Bonaparte, the demigod of war, carved an empire across Europe and died of boredom and arsenic on a remote Atlantic rock. Fouché, the man who served them all, died a multimillionaire duke in his bed. This is the core question, the central dramatic mystery. What was his secret? Was it merely a lack of principle? A base instinct for self-preservation? Or was it something deeper, a genius for reading the hidden currents of history, an almost scientific understanding of human fear and ambition? His life is the ultimate testament to the idea that, in times of chaos, the survivor is not the strongest nor the most brilliant, but the one most adaptable to change, the one who understands that the only true principle is to endure. To understand this man, we must first understand the world on the brink, the macro-level chessboard upon which his deadly game would be played. The late 18th century was a pressure cooker of contradictions. It was the Ancien Régime, a world of sublime art and stinking gutters, of exquisite courtly manners and brutal public executions. Across the English Channel, a rival British Empire was consolidating its global maritime power, its industrial revolution beginning to churn out the technologies that would define the next century. To the east, the vast, ponderous Russian Empire under Catherine the Great was expanding south and west, a sleeping giant beginning to stir and cast a long shadow over European affairs. The monarchies of Prussia and Austria, ancient and proud, were locked in a complex dance of rivalry and alliance, their professional armies the gold standard of disciplined warfare. But the heart of this world, its cultural and intellectual center, was France. A nation of 26 million souls, it was the most populous and seemingly most powerful kingdom in Europe, yet it was a giant rotting from within. King Louis XVI, a well-meaning but indecisive locksmith, presided over a court at Versailles that was a gilded cage of absurd etiquette and ruinous expense, disconnected from the realities of a starving populace. The French state was technically bankrupt, its treasury drained by extravagant wars, most recently its decisive but costly support for the American Revolution, an act that ironically helped export the dangerous ideas of liberty and republicanism back into its own absolutist society. Meanwhile, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, the writings of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot, had for decades been eroding the twin pillars of the old order, the divine right of kings and the unquestionable authority of the Church. A new and dangerous idea was in the air, that sovereignty resided not with the king, but with the people. This was the world Fouché was born into, a world of rigid hierarchy on the verge of implosion, a society where birthright was everything, leaving a man of obscure origins and immense talent, with no path to power except through the cracks that were about to appear in the very foundation of civilization. The origins of the future. Duke of Otranto were as gray and unremarkable as the misty Atlantic coast from which he hailed. Born in 1759 near the port city of Nantes, Joseph Fouché was not the product of aristocracy or military renown, but of the modest merchant class. He was a frail, anemic, and conspicuously pale child, with a face that seemed destined for obscurity. His thin lips, cold, watchful eyes, and silent demeanor set him apart from other children. Lacking the physical robustness for the seafaring life of his father, his path was guided towards the church, the only ladder for a clever but unconnected boy in the old regime. He was educated by the Oratorian order, a congregation of priests known for their role in education. It was within the cold, damp, and silent walls of the seminary that the true forging of his character took place. Here, he did not find God, but he found something far more useful for the world to come, the mastery of human psychology. For 10 years, he lived a life of quiet discipline, first as a student, then as a teacher of mathematics and physics. This was his true apprenticeship. In the closed society of the monastery, with its whispered intrigues, its unspoken hierarchies, and its constant observation, Fouché learned the art of silence. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to wear a mask of placid conformity, to discern a man's secret desires and fears from a fleeting glance or an unguarded word. He taught logic and science, disciplines that sharpened his mind towards cold, empirical analysis, stripping away the passions and ideologies that cloud judgment. He was a secular monk, a student not of scripture, but of the human soul's dark machinery. This decade of monastic quietude was the crucible that created the perfect spy master. It taught him patience, emotional detachment, and the profound understanding that men are not moved by grand ideas, but by small, petty vices: greed, fear, envy, and lust. He left the order just as the first tremors of the revolution were shaking France, not yet a man of politics, but a master of secrets, stepping out of the shadows of the cloister and into the blinding, bloody glare of history. The first step into the great game, the moment that forever severed Joseph Fouché from the quiet obscurity of his past, came in January of 1793. It was the trial of citizen Louis Capet, formerly King Louis XVI. The National Convention, the revolutionary heart of the new French Republic, was a cauldron of raw emotion, of furious oratory and deadly political maneuvering. The very soul of the revolution was at stake in this decision. To spare the king was to show weakness, to invite counter-revolution and the wrath of the Parisian mobs. To execute him was to throw down a bloody gauntlet to every monarchy in Europe, to burn the final bridge to the old world and plunge France into a fight to the death. Fouché, now a deputy from Nantes, had arrived in Paris as a moderate, a member of the centrist Girondin faction. He had privately assured his constituents that he would vote against the king's death. But in the superheated atmosphere of the convention, he applied his cold, scientific logic. He listened to the soaring rhetoric of Vergniaud and the venomous tirades of Marat. He observed the galleries, packed with armed sans-culottes, their faces grim, their voices a low growl promising death to any who would defend the tyrant. Fouché understood that this was not a trial about justice. It was a test of loyalty, a declaration of intent. Survival meant siding with the rising power, and the rising power was the radical faction of the Mountain, led by Robespierre and Danton. When his name was called, he walked slowly to the rostrum. There was no passion in his voice, no revolutionary fire. In a flat, toneless, almost clerical whisper that sent a chill through the hall, he uttered his verdict: La mort. Death. With that single word, he committed his first great betrayal, abandoning his patrons and his stated principles. But it was also his first great act of political genius. He had made himself a regicide. There was no going back. He had bound his fate irrevocably to the revolution, ensuring that for all the regimes to come, his enemies could never accuse him of being a secret royalist. It was an act of political baptism, a sacrament of blood that washed away his provincial moderation and marked him as a man of the radical new order. To comprehend the unnerving consistency of Joseph Fouché's betrayals, one must look beyond simple opportunism and uncover the secret, almost religious doctrine that governed his actions. His inner demon was not a lust for gold, though he would acquire an immense fortune, nor was it a thirst for glory, for he always preferred to operate from the shadows. His driving force was a cold, pathological terror of powerlessness, a deep-seated fear of being erased and forgotten. Forged in his youth as an obscure, physically unimpressive teacher in a world that prized birth and bravado. This fear mutated into what can only be described as a theology of survival, a belief system in which his own indispensability was the highest good. He saw politics not as a clash of ideologies. Republicanism, monarchism, Bonapartism were to him merely different costumes worn by the same frail and foolish human actors, but as a chaotic system governed by predictable forces, a kind of political physics. His decade in the seminary had taught him to see the world as a fallen place, driven by base self-interest. He had the conviction of a cynical priest that mankind was irredeemable and that any political system built on ideals of virtue or loyalty was doomed to collapse. His God was the state, an abstract entity whose survival was paramount, and he saw himself as its high priest, its necessary guardian. This gave him a peculiar form of justification for his endless treacheries. When he betrayed Robespierre, he was saving the Republic from the madness of the Terror. When he betrayed the Directory for Bonaparte, he was saving France from chaos and weakness. When he betrayed Napoleon for the Bourbons, he was saving the nation from endless war and destruction. In his own mind, he was not a traitor to men. He was the ultimate servant of France itself, the one constant physician attending to the nation's chronic illnesses. This core belief that he, and he alone, stood between order and annihilation was the source of his unnerving calm and his absolute ruthlessness. It allowed him to send men to their deaths in Lyon with the detachment of a surgeon removing a tumor, and to switch allegiances with the cold logic of a mathematician solving an equation. His secret motivation was the conviction that without Joseph Fouché at the center of the web, the entire edifice of the state would collapse into dust. The intricate dance of alliance and rivalry that would define Joseph Fouché's entire career began not in the tumultuous halls of Paris, but years earlier in the provincial quiet of Arras. It was here that he had his fateful encounter with a man who would become his first great nemesis and his first great lesson in the art of political survival: Maximilien Robespierre. In the late 1780s, before the world turned upside down, Fouché was a humble physics teacher at the Oratorian College, and Robespierre was a fastidious, ambitious local lawyer, already known for his passionate advocacy for the poor and his rigid moral compass. They were both men on the outside of the established order, members of the provincial intelligentsia, brimming with the ideas of Rousseau and the Enlightenment. They became friends, or something like it. Robespierre, the austere idealist, was reportedly a frequent guest at Fouché's home. There is even a persistent, though likely apocryphal story that Robespierre borrowed money from Fouché and perhaps even briefly courted his future wife's sister. This early relationship was a meeting of two opposite poles of the coming revolution. Robespierre was a true believer, a man who saw the world in stark black and white, as a battle between virtue and corruption. He was a political theologian, convinced that a perfect society could be engineered through the ruthless application of principle. Fouché, by contrast, was already a supreme pragmatist, a man who saw the world in infinite shades of gray. He was a political scientist, interested not in how men should be, but in how they are. Weak, fearful, and easily manipulated. Their paths diverged sharply once they arrived in Paris as deputies to the National Convention. While Robespierre ascended to become the incorruptible, the high priest of the Terror, Fouché followed a more serpentine path. The initial friendship curdled into suspicion, then into mortal enmity. Robespierre, the ideologue, came to see Fouché as the embodiment of everything he despised: cynicism, atheism, and corruption. Fouché, the pragmatist, saw in Robespierre a dangerous fanatic, a man whose rigid virtue was leading France into a suicidal death spiral. This early, broken friendship was the template for Fouché's future. He had looked into the soul of the revolutionary fanatic and understood his greatest weakness: the conviction that he was always right. It was a lesson Fouché would never forget. The winter of 1793 was a season of biblical cold and revolutionary fury, and it was in the rebellious city of Lyon that Joseph Fouché first revealed the terrifying depths of his ruthlessness. This was the first great payment on the price of power. Lyon, France's second city, had risen up against the radical Jacobin government in Paris, and the convention's response was swift and merciless. They decreed that Lyon is no more, and sent Fouché, along with Collot d'Herbois, as proconsuls to make that decree a reality. What followed was a sensory assault of methodical horror. The air of the city, shrouded in a freezing fog rolling off the Rhone, soon became thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the metallic smell of blood. The guillotine, deemed too slow for the scale of retribution required, was supplemented by a more industrial method of killing. Fouché orchestrated the infamous myriades, groups of 60, then 100, then 200 condemned prisoners were chained together in ditches on the Plaine de Brotteaux, outside the city walls. Cannons loaded with grape shot were fired into the screaming, writhing masses of human flesh. The sound was a wet, sickening thud, followed by a chorus of inhuman shrieks that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Those who were not killed by the initial blast were finished off with sabers and pistols by soldiers who waded through the mud and gore. By Fouché's own accounting, nearly 2,000 people were executed in a matter of weeks. He oversaw this butchery with a chilling, administrative calm, signing death warrants with a steady hand and writing back to Paris that the blood of criminals fertilizes the soil of liberty. This was more than just revenge. It was a calculated political act. Fouché, the moderate, needed to erase all doubt about his revolutionary credentials. The Butcher of Lyon was born. He was proving to the masters in Paris, and especially to the watchful Robespierre, that he was willing to do whatever was necessary. He was baptizing himself in the blood of counter-revolutionaries to secure his own position, demonstrating a capacity for pragmatic cruelty that would become his trademark and his curse for the rest of his life. In the crucible of the French Revolution, the greatest single adversary was not a foreign army or a political rival, but the relentless, impersonal, and insatiable mechanism of the terror itself, the guillotine. It was more than a machine of execution. It became a malevolent force with its own logic, a symbol of a revolution that had begun to devour its own children. For a man like Fouché, whose entire philosophy was based on control and prediction, this chaotic, self-perpetuating cycle of death was the ultimate antagonist. Initially, the terror had a brutal logic: to eliminate the enemies of the Republic, royalists, aristocrats, priests. But by 1794, under the messianic leadership of Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, it had metastasized into a paranoid purge of the revolutionaries themselves. The air in Paris was thick with suspicion. A careless word, a private grudge, an accusation from a jealous neighbor could lead to a midnight arrest and a swift journey to the Place de la Révolution. The revolution had become a monstrous deity that demanded constant human sacrifice. Yesterday's heroes became today's traitors. The Girondins who had founded the Republic were guillotined. The Hébertists on the far left were guillotined. Then Danton and his followers, who argued for a moderation of the terror, were themselves sent to the guillotine. Fouché, watching this from the sidelines after his bloody work in Lyon, understood the terrifying new rule of the game. You had to kill before you were killed. The guillotine was an instrument of ideological purity, and in Robespierre's Republic of Virtue, there was no room for cynical, worldly atheists like Fouché. He knew that the logic of the terror would eventually lead to him. His conflict was not with a man he could outwit or a faction he could join, but with an abstract, fanatical idea that demanded absolute conformity or death. He had to dismantle the very engine of the terror to survive, but to do so, he would have to confront its high priest, a man who had come to see himself as the living embodiment of the revolution's will. The spring of 1794 marked the moment Joseph Fouché's carefully constructed career came crashing down, representing his first fatal mistake and a profound psychological breaking point. Having returned from his bloody proconsulship in Lyon, he expected to be feted as a true revolutionary who had crushed a dangerous insurrection. Instead, he found himself walking into a trap. Maximilien Robespierre, now at the zenith of his power, had launched his final, most fanatical purge, seeking to establish a republic of virtue based on his deistic cult of the supreme being. Fouché, the notorious atheist, who had mockingly presided over anti-clerical festivals and declared that death is an eternal sleep, was the living embodiment of the cynical corruption Robespierre sought to eradicate. He was publicly denounced by the incorruptible in a fiery speech at the Jacobin Club. Robespierre accused him of perfidy, of amassing a fortune in Lyon, and of shielding traitors. For Fouché, this was more than a political attack. It was a death sentence. To be condemned by Robespierre's voice was to be marked for the guillotine. Suddenly, the master of intrigue was the one being hunted. He was stripped of his authority, expelled from the Jacobin Club, and forced into the shadows. This was his period in the wilderness. He became a political phantom, flitting through the corridors of the National Convention, his face even paler than usual, his eyes darting nervously. He saw former colleagues avert their gaze, terrified of being associated with a marked man. For weeks, he lived in constant fear of the midnight knock on the door. This experience of absolute powerlessness, of being the hunted prey, was a crucial moment in his psychological development. He understood then that even the most brutal application of force, as he had shown in Lyon, was no guarantee of safety. Power was ephemeral. The only true security lay in neutralizing the source of the threat, completely and permanently. The fear of his own death, the humiliation of being cast out, burned away any last vestiges of loyalty or ideology. It forged in him a cold, diamond-hard resolve. He would never be powerless again. And to ensure that, Robespierre had to die. From the depths of his terror, politically broken and marked for death, Joseph Fouché orchestrated his masterpiece of survival, a perfect example of seizing opportunity from chaos. The summer of 1794 was the height of the Great Terror, a period of suffocating paranoia that Fouché realized could be turned against its creator. Robespierre ruled through fear, but that fear was a double-edged sword. The members of the National Convention were terrified of him, but they were also terrified for their own lives. No one felt safe. The purges had become so indiscriminate that even the most loyal Jacobins and the most blood-soaked members of the Committee of Public Safety began to wonder if their names were next on the list. This universal fear was the chaotic energy Fouché would harness. Operating from the shadows, he became a missionary of fear. He moved like a ghost from deputy to deputy, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. To the moderates, he would say, "Your name is on Robespierre's list." To the corrupt but powerful members of the committee like Barras and Tallien, who feared an investigation into their illicit fortunes, he would murmur, "He knows about your dealings. You will be next." To the former terrorists, who, like him, had been recalled from the provinces, he would show them a fabricated list of 30 deputies marked for execution, with their own names prominent at the top. He played on every man's secret guilt and primal fear. He didn't create a grand conspiracy with a single leader. He wove together dozens of small, desperate plots, uniting men who despised each other with a common terror of the incorruptible. He was the invisible weaver of the plot of 9th of Thermidor. On the fateful day, when Robespierre ascended the rostrum to deliver a speech threatening yet another purge, the trap was sprung. The deputies, whom Fouché had spent weeks priming, shouted him down. The spell of fear was broken. The man who had sent thousands to their death found that his own voice was drowned out. Within 48 hours, Robespierre and his key allies were outlawed and then executed, without trial, on the very guillotine that had been the instrument of their power. Fouché had not only survived, he had brought down the most powerful man in France, not with an army or a mob, but with a whisper. Following the fall of Robespierre, France lurched through the chaotic and corrupt years of the Directory, a regime of venal politicians and nouveau riche speculators. In this unstable world, a man of Fouché's talents was not left in the shadows for long. In 1799, he achieved the position that seemed tailor-made for his unique skills, the one that would become the very source of his power and legend. He was appointed Minister of Police. This was his greatest triumph to date, the moment he transitioned from a mere survivor into the indispensable guardian of the state. The Ministry of Police was a relatively new creation, but in Fouché's hands, it became the central nervous system of the French government. His office on the Quai Voltaire became the most feared and respected building in Paris. From here, he began to construct the most formidable intelligence network Europe had ever seen. The sensory experience of his ministry was one of quiet, bureaucratic omniscience. It was a world of sealed letters, coded messages, and softly closing doors. The air smelled of ink, sealing wax, and the dry dust of endless files. Fouché sat at the center of this web, like a pale, patient spider. His agents were everywhere. They were society hostesses in the salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, prostitutes in the brothels of the Palais Royal, disgruntled servants in the homes of foreign diplomats, and radical workers in the taverns of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. He had spies in the army, in the ministries, and even among the other directors themselves. He paid for information from all sides, royalists, Jacobins, bankers, and priests. Every day, a river of reports flowed onto his desk, giving him an almost godlike overview of the nation's secret life: a planned royalist uprising in the Vendée, a Jacobin plot to overthrow the government, a financial scandal about to break. He mastered the art of information control, using his knowledge to defuse plots before they began, to blackmail political rivals, and to make himself the one man who knew all the state's secrets. He was no longer just a politician. He was the nation's confessor, its protector, and its blackmailer. At the summit of his clandestine empire, the psychology of Joseph Fouché underwent a profound transformation. He was no longer the frightened man hiding from Robespierre, but the architect of a new kind of power, a power based not on terror or military force, but on information. In his own mind, he had transcended the grubby world of politics to become something more, the high priest of the modern state. He saw himself as the only rational man in a nation of hysterics. He viewed the French people, and indeed all humanity, with a physician's cold detachment. They were a sick patient, prone to fevers of idealism, whether royalist or Jacobin, and his role was to manage the disease, to keep the patient stable through a carefully administered diet of surveillance, manipulation, and occasional surgical interventions. His daily police bulletins, delivered to the leaders of the state, first the directors, then Consul Bonaparte, became his sacred texts. In these reports, he didn't just convey raw intelligence, he shaped the narrative, subtly guiding the hand of power, highlighting the threats he wanted them to see, and downplaying those he deemed irrelevant. He saw this not as manipulation, but as responsible governance. He believed that he alone possessed the clarity to distinguish a genuine conspiracy from idle chatter, a real threat from a phantom menace. This sense of unique insight bred a quiet but immense arrogance. He was the man who knew everything. He knew which general was in debt, which minister had a mistress, which banker was funding the opposition. This knowledge gave him a feeling of ultimate control, a kind of intellectual superiority over the great men of action who strutted and fretted on the public stage. While they were busy with battles and speeches, He was tending to the intricate, hidden machinery of the state. This belief in his own indispensability, this conviction that he was the secret guardian of order, was the core of his hubris. It was a pride that would eventually lead him into a direct collision course with the one man in Europe whose ego and ambition dwarfed even his own. The arrival of Napoleon Bonaparte on the political scene presented Joseph Fouché with the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity of his career. Their relationship became the central drama of the next 15 years, a fascinating and poisonous duel between two masters of power who were, in many ways, mirror opposites. Napoleon was the Corsican Titan, a demigod of battle, a man of explosive energy, grand visions, and monumental ego. He operated in the blinding light of glory, his power rooted in the adoration of his army and the spectacle of his victories. Fouché was the man of shadows, his power rooted in silence, secrets, and the patient accumulation of knowledge. Napoleon was charisma. Fouché was calculation. One was the lion, the other the spider. They were drawn to each other by a mutual recognition of genius and necessity. When Bonaparte returned from Egypt in 1799, planning his coup d'état, he knew he needed the minister of police on his side. Fouché, for his part, had seen the weakness and corruption of the Directory and calculated that the future belonged to the brilliant young general. He aided the coup of 18 Brumaire not through action, but through inaction, ensuring the police did not interfere as Bonaparte seized power. Thus began their complex symbiosis. Napoleon needed Fouché's police machine to secure his new regime, to hunt down royalist assassins and Republican conspirators. Fouché needed Napoleon to provide the stability and authority that would allow him to perfect his system of control. Yet, their alliance was laced with profound mistrust. Napoleon was both fascinated and repelled by his police minister. He once said, "I have only one patriot, Fouché. He is the only one, but he is a terrible scoundrel." He recognized Fouché's competence, but sensed correctly that his minister's only true loyalty was to himself. Fouché, in turn, served the first consul and later emperor with remarkable efficiency, but he never succumbed to the Napoleonic myth. He saw the general not as a demigod, but as a supremely talented but reckless gambler whose ambition would one day lead France to ruin. And so he served him, all the while preparing for the day he would fall, gathering secrets and maintaining his own independent network, a state within the state, ready for the next chapter in the endless saga of power. Joseph Fouché's tenure as Minister of Police was not merely a passive exercise in spying and intrigue. It was an active and visionary project of state-building. He was the architect of the modern security state, forging the bureaucratic and methodological tools of surveillance and control that would be imitated and perfected by governments for the next 2 centuries. Before Fouché, police work was often a haphazard affair of clumsy informers and brutal interrogations. He transformed it into a science. He centralized all security functions under his direct command, creating a clear chain of authority that ran from his office in Paris down to the smallest provincial town. He divided the ministry into ruthlessly efficient departments, each with a specific function. One for monitoring the press and public opinion, another for tracking political subversives, a third for counter-espionage against foreign powers, and a fourth, the notorious Cabinet Noir, for systematically intercepting and reading the mail of prominent citizens. He created the first comprehensive filing system of political dossiers, a vast paper archive containing the secrets, weaknesses, and connections of every person of influence in France. This was the true source of his power, an institutional memory of the nation's sins. Furthermore, he perfected the use of agents provocateurs, spies who would infiltrate subversive groups not just to report on their activities, but to encourage them, to steer them into premature action where they could be easily crushed. He understood the power of public opinion better than any of his contemporaries, using a portion of his secret budget to pay journalists and playwrights to promote the government's agenda and to subtly discredit its enemies. His police were not just an instrument of repression. They were an instrument of governance. They provided detailed reports on the price of bread, the mood in the markets, and the morale of the populace, allowing the government to anticipate social unrest and act preemptively. This machine was his true legacy. It was a cold, efficient, and amoral system of control that was so effective that it would outlive him and the emperor he served, becoming a permanent feature of the French state, ready to be used by any regime, be it monarchy, empire, or republic. While the public face of Joseph Fouché was that of the cold, ascetic spymaster, a man seemingly devoid of personal passion, his private life offers a glimpse into the complex context of his decisions. This is the onions and vegetables of his story. In 1792, he married Bonne Jeanne Coignard, the daughter of a provincial administrator. By all accounts, their marriage was a surprisingly stable and affectionate one. She was reportedly plain and serious, a partner who understood the precarious world her husband inhabited and provided a sanctuary of bourgeois normality away from the deadly intrigues of Paris. Together, they had several children, and Fouché, the man who sent thousands to their deaths, appeared to be a devoted, if emotionally distant father. His primary concern was securing a future for them, and this drove his second great passion, the accumulation of a colossal fortune. He used his position as Minister of Police to amass wealth on a scale that dwarfed the old aristocracy. He took kickbacks from military suppliers, extorted money from illegal gambling houses, which he allowed to operate under his protection, and made vast sums speculating on the stock market using the insider information that flowed across his desk. By the height of the empire, his fortune was estimated at over 15 million francs, making him one of the wealthiest men in France. This wealth was not for lavish display. It was for security. It was the foundation of his dynasty, the means to ensure that his children would never experience the powerlessness of his own youth. He bought a magnificent estate at Ferrières, and, in one of history's great ironies, this regicide who had voted to strip the nobility of their privileges coveted a title more than anything. Napoleon, understanding this weakness, eventually granted it to him, making him the Duke of Otranto in 1809. His family life and his fortune were two sides of the same coin. They were a fortress he built against the chaos of the world, a desperate attempt by the master of secrets to create a legacy that could not be erased by the next turn of the political wheel. For a decade, the partnership between Napoleon and Fouché, however strained, had been brutally effective. But in 1809, the first serious cracks appeared in their alliance, revealing the profound ideological chasm between the two men. This was the Walcheren affair, Fouché's first great miscalculation. The emperor was away from France, fighting a difficult campaign against the Austrians that culminated in the bloody Battle of Wagram. While the bulk of the French army was hundreds of miles away on the Danube, the British launched a massive amphibious invasion, landing 40,000 troops on the Dutch island of Walcheren with the aim of seizing Antwerp. Paris was in a panic. The government was paralyzed, with most of the regular troops absent. It was in this moment of crisis that Fouché, then serving as both Minister of Police and Minister of the Interior, made a fateful decision. Acting on his own authority, without waiting for orders from the distant emperor, he took charge. He issued a stirring proclamation, calling on the citizens to defend the nation. More significantly, he used his authority to reactivate the old units of the National Guard, a citizen militia, with revolutionary and republican overtones that Napoleon deeply distrusted. Fouché's logic was impeccable. It was a national emergency, and he was using the resources at hand to defend the homeland. His mobilization was swift and effective, and the British threat to Antwerp was contained. However, when Napoleon learned of this back at his headquarters, he was not grateful. He was incandescent with fury. He saw Fouché's actions not as patriotic competence, but as a supreme act of hubris and a direct challenge to his authority. Who was this police minister to raise an army in his name? In Napoleon's paranoid mind, an army raised by Fouché could one day be used against him. For the emperor, there could be only one source of power and initiative in the state: himself. The incident exposed their fundamental disagreement. Fouché believed in the abstract state, which must be defended by any means necessary. Napoleon believed only in personal power. The spider had overstepped his web, and the emperor would neither forgive nor forget it. The Walcheren affair had planted a seed of deep suspicion in Napoleon's mind, but it was Fouché's next act of supreme arrogance that would trigger his downfall. This was the fateful decision to conduct his own secret foreign policy. By 1810, Fouché had become convinced that Napoleon's endless wars were bleeding France dry and would inevitably lead to his destruction. He saw the emperor as a genius trapped by his own nature, a man incapable of making a lasting peace. Driven by his unique brand of patriotic hubris, Fouché came to believe that he alone could save France from the emperor's self-destructive ambition. He decided that he would be the one to secure the peace with Britain that had eluded Napoleon for so long. Without any official sanction, using a shady financier as a back-channel intermediary, Fouché opened secret negotiations with the British cabinet. It was an act of breathtaking audacity, a minister of state conducting his own diplomacy in direct opposition to the known policy of his sovereign. The psychology behind this error was complex. It was partly a calculated risk, an attempt to create an outcome where he could present Napoleon with a fait accompli and be hailed as a savior. But it was also driven by his deep-seated intellectual arrogance, his conviction that he understood the strategic situation of Europe better than the military genius who conquered it. He saw Napoleon as a man blinded by glory, while he was the clear-eyed realist. He failed to comprehend the one inviolable rule of Napoleon's world. All power, all glory, all initiative flowed from the emperor alone. He had fundamentally misjudged the psychology of his master, believing he could be managed through reason and results, when in fact Napoleon was a creature of passion and ego who would tolerate competence, but never independent authority. This secret negotiation was not just a political misstep, it was an act of treason born from the conviction that he was smarter than God, and it would bring the full weight of imperial wrath crashing down upon him. The discovery of Fouché's clandestine negotiations with the British triggered one of the most famous and dramatic confrontations of the Napoleonic era. The emperor, having been alerted to the back-channel communications by his own spies, summoned his minister of police to the palace of Saint-Cloud in June of 1810. This was Fouché's greatest catastrophe. He walked into the emperor's study to find Napoleon in a state of controlled, volcanic fury. The sensory experience of the room must have been terrifying. The emperor pacing back and forth, his face pale with rage, his voice a low, menacing growl, while Fouché stood motionless, his own face an impassive mask, struggling to maintain his composure. Napoleon unleashed a torrent of abuse, accusing him of treachery and betrayal. "You are a traitor," Napoleon seethed. "I ought to have you hanged from the gallows." He accused Fouché of thinking he was the king, of running his own government, of believing he could dispose of the crown. For Fouché, this was the ultimate humiliation. For 15 years, he had been the man in the know, the one who pulled the strings from the shadows. Now he was exposed, caught in a clumsy plot, and being dressed down like a common servant. In that moment, all his intellectual arrogance, all his carefully constructed networks, all his accumulated secrets were worthless. He had been outplayed, his hubris leading directly to his ruin. Napoleon did not have him executed. He was still too valuable, and perhaps the emperor feared the secrets he might reveal in a public trial. But he did what Fouché feared most. He stripped him of his power. He was dismissed as Minister of Police, his seals of office taken from him. He was politically annihilated, sent into a form of internal exile, first as a figurehead governor of Rome, and then forced to retire to his estate in disgrace. The spider's web had been torn apart, and the spider himself cast out. For the first time in his revolutionary career, the master survivor appeared to have finally, definitively, lost the game. From 1812 to 1814, as the Napoleonic Empire began its spectacular collapse, Joseph Fouché endured his time in the political wilderness. He was a ghost at the feast of the empire's ruin. While Napoleon led the 500,000-strong Grande Armée on its fatal march to Moscow, Fouché was living in forced retirement on his estate near Aix-en-Provence, far from the center of power. From there, he watched, with the cold, analytical gaze of a political pathologist, as the emperor's grand ambitions turned to ashes. He read the heavily censored bulletins from the front, but his own network of contacts allowed him to read between the lines. He heard the whispers of the catastrophic retreat from Russia, the news of an entire army of veterans freezing to death in the snows, a disaster that broke the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. This was the collapse he had long predicted, the inevitable result of the emperor's unrestrained hubris. While others despaired, Fouché waited. He was a patient fisherman, knowing the tide of history was turning. Napoleon, desperate for competent administrators, as he tried to patch together a new army of raw conscripts, briefly recalled Fouché in 1813, not as Minister of Police, but to a distant, irrelevant post as governor of the Illyrian provinces. It was a clear signal. The emperor still needed his talent, but trusted him so little that he wanted him as far from Paris as possible. As the allied armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Britain closed in on France in 1814, Fouché found himself in Italy, cut off from the main theater of war. But he was not idle. He was already making contact with Napoleon's brother-in-law, Murat, the King of Naples, subtly encouraging his betrayal of the emperor. He was positioning himself for the endgame. The crumbling of the empire was not a tragedy to him. It was the ultimate opportunity, the last chance to return to the center of the web. The supposedly broken man was simply waiting for the chaos to become so complete that France would once again have no choice but to turn to the one man who knew how to navigate it. The final act of Joseph Fouché's political life was his most audacious, his most treacherous, and his most brilliant performance. It unfolded during the 100 Days in the spring of 1815, when Napoleon escaped from his exile on Elba and triumphantly returned to Paris. He knew he was in a desperate situation, facing a united Europe determined to crush him once and for all. He needed the ablest men in France, and that meant he needed Fouché. In a stunning reversal, he reappointed his former Minister of Police, the man he had called a traitor, to his old post. Napoleon hoped to buy Fouché's loyalty, but Fouché knew the emperor's second reign was doomed. He accepted the ministry not to serve Napoleon, but to control the inevitable transition of power that would follow his defeat. This was his final, masterful betrayal. While serving as Napoleon's chief of security, he was simultaneously in secret communication with all of the emperor's enemies, with Metternich in Austria, with Wellington, and most importantly, with the agents of the exiled king, Louis XIII. He played a breathtaking double game. He would show some of the royalist correspondence to Napoleon to prove his loyalty, while holding back the most damning evidence and continuing his own clandestine negotiations. His goal was to make himself the indispensable man in the aftermath of the coming French defeat. When the news of the catastrophe at Waterloo reached Paris, Fouché acted with lightning speed. While others panicked, he was the picture of calm. He used his influence in the legislature to force Napoleon's second and final abdication. For a few extraordinary days, with the emperor gone and the king not yet returned, Joseph Fouché, the Duke of Otranto, was the head of the provisional government, the de facto ruler of France. The regicide who had voted for the death of a king now held the fate of the monarchy in his hands. In a final, sublime act of cynicism, he negotiated the peaceful return of Louis XIII to Paris, thereby preventing a bloody civil war and a punitive foreign occupation. He had betrayed everyone, and in doing so, had made himself the sole arbiter of the nation's destiny. The legacy of Joseph Fouché is a battlefield of conflicting interpretations, a historical Rorschach test in which posterity sees what it wants to see. He is perhaps the most purely polarizing figure of his era. To his detractors, and they are legion, he is the consummate traitor, the very embodiment of political cynicism and amoral ambition. He is the priest who betrayed God, the moderate who betrayed the king, the radical who betrayed Robespierre, the director who betrayed the Republic, and the imperial minister who betrayed the emperor. French royalists saw him as a loathsome regicide, a creature of the terror who managed to slither his way into power. Bonapartists viewed him as the ultimate Judas, the man who sold out his master at the critical hour. For romantic historians of the 19th century, he was the archetypal villain, the cold-blooded spider, in contrast to the passionate lions like Danton and Napoleon. He represents the triumph of vice over virtue, of calculation over courage. However, a more modern and perhaps more nuanced interpretation sees him in a different light. This school of thought, championed by writers like Stefan Zweig, presents Fouché not as a villain, but as the ultimate political realist, a pragmatic patriot who, in his own cynical way, consistently worked to save France from its own worst impulses. In this view, every one of his betrayals was aimed at a greater good. He betrayed Robespierre to end the terror. He betrayed the corrupt Directory to bring about the stability of the consulate. He betrayed Napoleon to end a cycle of endless, ruinous war. And he engineered the return of the Bourbons to prevent a devastating foreign invasion and the partition of France. He was the sober physician in a nation of madmen, the only one willing to make the ugly, immoral choices necessary to ensure the survival of the state. Was he the father of the modern police state, a forerunner of the totalitarian surveillance systems of the 20th century? Or was he the savior of the state, a master statesman who navigated the most chaotic quarter-century in French history with unmatched skill? The conflict of interpretations remains, leaving him as a deeply uncomfortable but undeniably modern figure. The man who proved that in the game of power, the survivor is often the one with no principles at all. We arrive at last at the solution to the central paradox of his life. How did Joseph Fouché, a man of no fixed loyalties, outlive every ruler, every ideologue, and every hero of his age? The answer lies in his survivor's creed, a political philosophy so cold and pragmatic that it borders on the inhuman. Fouché survived because he was loyal not to men, whom he knew to be fragile, emotional, and ephemeral, nor to ideologies, republicanism, Bonapartism, royalism, which he saw as mere temporary justifications for the seizure of power. His one and only loyalty was to the abstract concept of power itself and to its eternal, unchanging source, the deep-seated weaknesses of human nature. While others studied philosophy or military strategy, Fouché studied fear, greed, vanity, and stupidity. He understood that these were the true levers of history. He survived Robespierre because he understood that the incorruptible's greatest weapon, fear, could be turned against him. He survived the Directory because he understood its venality and weakness. He survived Napoleon because he understood that the emperor's genius was shackled to an ego that would never allow him to stop, and that this fatal flaw would eventually destroy him. His second secret was his absolute emotional detachment. He possessed what has been called a refrigerated soul. He never allowed hatred, love, or personal loyalty to cloud his judgment. His betrayals were not acts of passion. They were calculated, logical moves in a complex chess game. When he handed over his list of co-conspirators to Barras to save himself from the Thermidorian reaction, it was without malice. When he organized the return of Louis XVIII, it was without any newfound love for the monarchy. Each act was a simple, logical solution to the problem of his own survival and, by extension, what he saw as the survival of France. Finally, he survived because he made himself indispensable. His police machine, his vast network of spies and secrets, became the nervous system of whatever regime was in power. To get rid of Fouché was to blind the state, to render it deaf and vulnerable. He was the necessary evil, the poison that also served as the only antidote. He did not outlive the giants of his era by being stronger or braver. He outlived them by making himself the one man they could not afford to kill. The ultimate verdict of history on Joseph Fouché is that he is the ghost in the machine of the modern state. His life offers a chilling and profoundly modern lesson about the nature of power. He represents the triumph of the administrator over the visionary, the bureaucrat over the charismatic leader, the spy over the soldier. While Napoleon represents the romantic, heroic vision of history as the story of great men and their grand ambitions, Fouché represents the colder, more cynical reality that history is often shaped behind the scenes by faceless, amoral men who manage the machinery of control. He is the precursor to the intelligence chiefs, the secret police directors, and the political technocrats of the 20th and 21st centuries. His career demonstrates that in the complex, centralized nations that emerged from the fires of the revolution, true power lies not in the crown or the flag, but in the control of information. He was the first to truly understand that knowledge is power, that surveillance is sovereignty. The universal lesson of his life is about the profound and often terrifying divorce between politics and morality. Fouché proved that it is possible to be a political genius while being a moral vacuum. He compels us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the qualities we often despise in a man, disloyalty, cynicism, a lack of conviction, can be in the brutal arena of politics, the very keys to survival and success. He is the patron saint of the pragmatist, the ultimate survivor who teaches that ideology is a luxury for those who can afford it, and that for the rest, the only ism that matters is survivalism. He is the ghost that still haunts the corridors of power, a perpetual reminder of the state's secret heart, its limitless capacity for surveillance, its cold-blooded pragmatism, and its amoral, unrelenting drive for self-preservation, with or without the consent of the governed. The final frame of this epic saga is not one of battlefield glory or revolutionary fervor. It is a scene of profound, almost banal, quiet. The year is 1820. The location is Trieste, a placid port city in the Austrian Empire. In a comfortable villa, surrounded by the immense fortune he has accumulated, an old man is dying in his bed. It is Joseph Fouché, the former Duke of Otranto. The world he shaped and manipulated has moved on. The revolutionary fires that once threatened to consume Europe are now just ashes, raked over by the cautious monarchs of the Restoration. The Emperor Napoleon, the man who made the continent tremble, is a prisoner on a desolate rock in the middle of the Atlantic, his legend already beginning to eclipse the memory of his tyranny. Danton, Robespierre, Saint-Just, all the fiery prophets of the New Age, are long dead, their bones mingled in common graves. But Fouché, the man who served and betrayed them all, the regicide who became a duke, the terrorist who died a millionaire, has won the only victory that ever mattered to him. He has survived. As he lies dying, he gives his son one final, cynical instruction: to burn his memoirs, to erase the last of his secrets from the historical record. It is his final act of control, his last manipulation of the narrative. The flame that consumes the papers is the perfect metaphor for his life. A quiet, smokeless fire that leaves no trace, a power that operated in the shadows and vanished without a sound, leaving behind only the unnerving silence of its complete and total victory.